Hi, my name is Alex, and in this episode of Magic Missile Minis, I'm going to be doing a quick tutorial on how to sculpt hands. So, the first hand that I want to show you guys how to do is one that I would try to do as often as possible, mostly because it's definitely the easiest to do out of all of these. And that's a hand that's holding something like a staff or a weapon. So the way I start it, like I start all of my hands, is getting a loose kind of square shape that I use for the main body of the hand itself. And then I can add the fingers. But one of the things I specifically do when doing hands already attached to things is add one large blob of green stuff and sculpt that piece of green stuff into the fingers rather than adding a bunch of small pieces of green stuff for the individual fingers. And when you add this big piece of green stuff, you want to make sure that the section that you're going to sculpt into the middle finger is longer than the rest of them, as opposed to making all of them the same size. To sculpt in the details for the fingers, as you've seen me doing here, I use a mixture of a needle as well as my flat rubber sculpting tool to make the divots have a little bit more roundness to them so the fingers don't just look like a bunch of lines in a flat piece of green stuff. I then add the thumb onto the hand, and I specifically sculpt out that piece of green stuff into a bit of a teardrop shape so that you can kind of incorporate the round base of the thumb that kind of protrudes out of the palm itself. You'll notice, especially when you clench your fist, that kind of muscle group becomes very, very noticeable in the thumb. And that's kind of the basics for how to sculpt a hand that's holding something. But what I'm more excited to show you guys is some of the tricks that I use to sculpt hands that aren't holding anything. And the main trick that I use for this is to make two of the fingers attached together and have a wire running through them. So in this hand, you can see that I've got the wire going through the top of the palm, and this wire is going to be connecting the index and middle finger. And so I'm going to have this guy looking like he's kind of casting some sort of spell, like drawing out runes in the air or something kind of cool like that. So as I sculpt this, I try to make sure there's a little bit of a curve in both of these fingers, and then I also am trying to again make sure that I'm getting across that the middle finger is longer than the index finger. And then I start to sculpt in the separation between the two fingers that are connected in the same way that I did for the other hand that I'd shown you guys earlier, using, in this case, my craft knife to do the first initial line and then making that a little bit more rounded with my flat sculpting tool. When you add the wire for the two fingers that are going to be connected, I suggest not having it go all the way to the end of either of the fingers so that you can kind of separate them a little bit at the end with one of your tools, and that kind of gives the illusion that they're not actually connected, they're just right next to each other. With those two fingers finished, I then go ahead and add the thumb in the same manner that I had done in the previous hand that I showed you guys, and then proceed to add the other fingers onto this hand after everything has already set, so that I don't have to worry about messing up the thumb or the two fingers I'd already done. And these other two fingers are done simply by rolling out a small little cylinder of green stuff and then attaching them on using my craft knife and kind of moving them into place a little bit. And then, of course, I repeat this process for the pinky. One tip that I would suggest for those of you who are starting working on this kind of stuff is honestly just look at your own hands and see what they do and what kind of position you want the hand to be in. And that way you have a reference for what you're actually trying to complete instead of just trying to think about what you imagine it would look like. A quick thing to also note is that you probably have noticed that these hands are a little bit big. All the stuff that I'm doing this can be translated into slightly smaller for like a D&D miniature or something like that. And honestly, when you make it smaller, you just have a lot more wiggle room to make more mistakes because people can't see them because of how tiny it is. But now moving on to the last hand that I'm going to be showing you guys is how to make a hand that looks like it's splayed out. I find this to be incredibly useful for my miniatures when you have them holding one thing and having the other hand kind of thrown backwards. It just makes for really, really dynamic poses. And as you can see me doing here, I follow a very similar process to the last hand that I showed you guys, but instead of combining the index and middle finger, I combined the ring finger and the middle finger. This is a trick that I just picked up from drawing character art and stuff like that I found it significantly easier to make a hand if the middle two fingers were connected. And so I translated that into miniature sculpting and it seemed to have a very similar effect. And with this hand pose especially, you can really play around with where you put the index and the pinky finger to add variation between all of your separate miniatures. I found that there's a surprising number of combinations of weird poses that you can have your index finger being a little bit more raised or your pinky finger being raised that actually still looks fairly natural when you have like a hand kind of thrown backwards if your character is in a spinning motion or something of that sort. One other detail that I wanted to point out that you can see me working on here is the shape that I make the last joint of the thumb. An easy way to make it look very anatomically correct is to add a little bit of a concave nature to it. If you stretch out your thumb as much as possible, you notice that it actually curves out, which is something that will really help, again, make your hand look more anatomically correct if you can add in this very subtle detail. But anyways, to finish up the hand, all you have to do is repeat the process that we had done for the hand before, but for the index finger and the pinky. And again, like I had mentioned before, you can actually play around with where you pose these guys quite a lot. In this hand, I just had them fairly flat for simplicity's sake, but you can kind of play around with having some of them be more crooked and more weird, and actually have it so that you could have some like evil weird spell being cast or something like that by having the hand be in a slightly more uncomfortable and unnatural position. And one last thing to note for sculpting hands is not to neglect the inside of the hand, especially if you have a hand that is kind of splayed out. I find myself focusing a lot on the back of the hand since most people will see that more, but sometimes the actual inside of the hand just looks like a blobby green stuff mess. So that's one thing to always keep in mind when you're doing hands as well. I hope that this tutorial was helpful. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to leave a comment, and also don't forget to like and subscribe and hit the notification bell to get notified of whenever I release a new video. As of filming this video, I'm not exactly sure of where I'm at with the Twitch streaming, but I'm sure there's a bunch of words on screen telling you that information. But for now, thank you so much for watching this video, and I'll see you guys in the next one.